Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is April the 18th, 2021, and the world is looking up-ish, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. The general trend is definitely positive. Yeah, the global economy is definitely on the uptick, the U.S. economy in particular. So, sunny uplands, it seems, are on the horizon.
Yeah, we talked about eventually having that upswing again, but there wasn't really any clear marker in sight of when that was going to take place. It seems like the vaccine distribution has been a thing that the U.S. has been doing comparatively well.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have maybe over half the country or something vaccinated. Do you know any stats on that?
Yeah, I think it's over half that has at least a dose of one of the vaccines. So we're definitely well on our way to getting near fully vaccinated by the end of the year, if not well sooner. Yeah, we didn't really do well on the stuff that we needed to do in response to COVID that required things like cooperation and community. But the stuff that involves production and distribution, we pretty well nailed that. American capitalism struggles with many things, but that's not one of them.
Yeah. We don't have a small pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. So we're managing the vaccines pretty well. Love it or hate it, but in general, having a relatively open approach in many states to dealing with the virus in terms of lockdowns has helped with the rebound. That just makes it a little easier for businesses to open up and start operating again and start hiring people. The unemployment rate is down, I think, to 6.5%, something around there. So it's well down from the it was like 11% not too long ago, and even higher than that, I think, at the height of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So, forward progress in that regard, and it'll probably continue. Near as we can tell, there's a lot of pent-up demand from last year. Just people who didn't spend money on going out and doing things who would have normally spent that money. And so there's a little bit of a nest egg saved up from 2020, and that's probably going to get shotgun out into the economy in mass here in 2021. So that'll be a nice source of demand for the economy to benefit from. Probably see it.
Do you want a funny story that's kind of linked to that?
No, go ahead.
So there was a sports player. I'll try not to be overly dramatic and say too many names and companies and stuff, but there is a professional athlete who has a Twitch stream, and the athlete was going to listen in on a meeting for a retail company who sells items in stores and stuff. And retail companies, no secret, have been doing very poorly in the pandemic because people are not going out to the malls and shopping and stuff. Yeah. And they were talking about their projections and how they anticipate people coming out and shopping a lot, kind of like what you're just saying, of there's going to be a bit of a rebound. But all of this was accidentally left on their live stream. So this very private meeting was just being uploaded live because someone forgot to turn their stream off at the end of the day.
Whoops.
Yep. Maybe some people saw that.
It's a little awkward.
Yep. That's
they talk about anything fail. Interesting?
It's kind of your typical meeting sort of thing. I wouldn't really say anything particularly zesty, just projections of where they're going and talking about where they are.
Gotcha. So just a little bit of awkwardness, no trade secrets or conspiracies or anything.
No, nothing too out of control. Someone did notice it partway through the meeting and said, "Sorry everyone, but it turns out this meeting has been live streamed, so we're going to convene for the day."
Yikes.
Yeah.
Well, there's been a lot of that for the past year, that I guess it was a Zoom meeting, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just a lot of people getting used to the new technology.
Yep.
Or not getting used to it, as the case may be.
Yeah, it's also a different way that people relate to their own privacy and stuff. Whenever you're having a Zoom meeting, you're not going to a place with other people. You're showing a window into your own home. And that's a bit different than your standard meeting culture and that kind of thing. But a lot of stuff has changed with quarantine. And I think a lot of that will leave a existing kind of mark on how we do stuff.
Yeah, probably more in the business world than any other sector or area, because there's just a lot of cost savings you can garnish from doing that instead of having the in-person meetings. A lot of business travel is basically just meetings. So if you can cut that out, you can save yourself a pretty penny.
Yeah, which has as a consequence less strain on the environment, which I don't think was something that people were going for, but it was an interesting trend to notice of as people are driving less and taking fewer flights, there's just way less of a carbon footprint from us.
Yeah, education probably won't change so much in that regard. I've talked to a couple, I don't have children myself, of course, but of the people I've talked to, almost all of them have relatively negative opinions of online learning. I know that there's people who are for it. I've seen, surveys and whatnot. There's, I think, people in the suburbs actually, kind of relatively more of those people don't have a problem with it. But in general, the impression seems to be negative. So I suspect that there's going to be a shift back to in-classroom learning broadly as soon as possible. To the point where that's actually a political issue. A lot of people around the country, Democrats or Republicans, want their kids back in school. Besides the fact that they think it's just better for their education, it's also just kind of a hassle having to deal with them out of school. You kind of got to handle some extra logistics in that regard, and not everybody is flexible enough to make that work.
Personally, I feel like the in-classroom learning is better for the purpose of removing distractions. Because for anyone who enjoys the old video game or two, it's not the most difficult thing ever to have two monitors and have a video game on one and your class on the other. And there isn't really a way to enforce that kind of a thing, which is also one of the reasons why when I was going to university, I didn't bring my laptop with me to classes, when it would be maybe more convenient to have my notes and stuff on a laptop that I type up, because I can type faster than I can write with the pencil. But I know that social media exists and that there's that pull of, well, I could check my Facebook. But then you go down rabbit holes of reading different posts and stuff, and you're not paying attention to the class anymore. So for me, it just helped me to consolidate the information better by writing it down as opposed to typing it. And then on top of that, not being tempted to be off task. So yeah, I can see why people would be against a full switch to online learning. For some people that might work. For me, being honest with myself, I would not be as good in that setting.
Yeah, it takes a lot of discipline. And, children are not known for that. So I think that's why some people prefer it more than others. But yeah, I think in general, there's a broad maybe not consensus, but broad preference for the in-class learning, specifically for the reasons you outlined. Let's see. So Zoom will be a change for the business culture, for the business world anyway. But I think another change we're looking at going into this post-COVID era, we're not quite in post-COVID yet, but we're kind of planning ahead for it at this point, or at least markets are. So that's kind of what we're talking about. One of the things we're looking at is inflation, which is not really something we've had in a while, at least not in the developed world. We've kind of been stuck with low inflation for a long time. And, that's not really a bad thing per se. Lower prices mean goods and services are more accessible to a broader part of the population. So, that's good for living standards, economic development, that kind of thing, real wages. Uh, but the downside is that it punishes savers. If you just want to save your money without investing in anything fancy, you can't really just get a certificate of deposit or leave your money in the bank or something like that and expect your money to grow. Interest rates are so low that it's just not practical. You're looking at like 0.5% interest or whatever it is. In some cases it's been negative. I don't think any bank charges a negative interest on deposits, but that's just how low it is. So you kind of, if you want to grow your savings, you kind of have to invest in something like stocks or something more exotic. There's just kind of no other way around it. So having low interest rates, which is partly a response to the low inflation and low economic growth, that's partly part and parcel of low inflation. And low inflation also kind of makes it hard for some businesses to kind of make it. Higher prices mean more profits, mean you can invest in the business, grow it, hire more people. But if there's not rising prices, there's not as much of an incentive to do that. Now, obviously, there's growth industries where there's a lot of that. There's a lot of capex and things like biomed and other hot sectors. But broad-based inflation can also benefit smaller sectors that don't grow as much, because it kind of just gives them a little headwind. Well, not headwind. It gives them a little boost. Tailwind, that's the word I wanted. So we could be moving into an inflationary economy. And I mean, it's no mystery why. The government is spending trillions and trillions of dollars. There's all the savings people have from 2020 that they're going to be spending in 2021. Lockdown restrictions are ending. International trade is easing up and getting, kind of coming back. So there's a lot of demand pressure that the global economy is encountering, and it's probably going to raise prices at least a bit. It already has, really. Just to kind of touch on some of the areas that have seen inflation thus far. Commodities have been increasing in price, no shock. Things like oil, lumber, etc. Metals, all of those have been going up in anticipation of renewed global economic growth. We talked about microchips and how there was shortages there. That has more to do with supply side restrictions. But there's also demand pull that's causing prices to go up there in that industry. And food prices, kind of similar to commodities, just going up in anticipation of greater global demand. And then in the United States, we've had construction material shortages, which I kind of didn't know about. But I was reading a little bit about it, and apparently that's also kind of more of a supply side thing, but there is significant demand pull there as well in the form of housing. One of the sort of unexpected, unanticipated economic phenomena that resulted from the COVID-19 crisis is that there was a huge uptick in demand for housing. People living in inner cities kind of moved out, gentrified neighborhoods, whatnot. They would move out to the suburbs and buy houses, or maybe out to the exurbs, or wherever. So there was a big shift in people out of the inner city towards suburbs and exurbs. And the result is that the housing market actually improved over the course of 2020, which I was not expecting anyway. I would have just assumed it would decline, but that didn't happen. So housing prices have definitely been increasing and are still increasing.
If you can't leave your house, you may as well have a good one, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much the logic. So that's pushing up demand for construction materials, since there's more houses being built in response to the higher prices. So higher housing prices, higher construction material prices, etc. So all of that is inflation in the economy. It hasn't really been enough to impact core inflation that much. Just like the basic basket of goods and services that people buy from month to month. That's core inflation. Or what the Fed calls consumer price index, I think. They have some fancy index that they construct to try to represent how much inflation is impacting regular people month to month. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that has really ticked up yet. Housing, education, stuff like that has been increasing in price for a long time. And then there's certain areas like food, commodities, etc., that are increasing right now. but none of it has increased enough to really impact core inflation much. And that's kind of been a weird phenomena we've seen for a long time. Partly that's just because consumers are insulated from, at least in the developed world, consumers are insulated somewhat from fluctuations in the prices of commodities because we have things like the food processing industry, the chemicals industry, etc. A lot of those commodities are refined, significantly so, before they reach consumers. And as a result, fluctuations in the price of just one commodity don't necessarily impact the final price of the final good all that much, like they would if there was less refining happening. That's one of the reasons food prices were so stable in the U.S., even when there was a lot of supply side restrictions due to lockdowns and whatnot.
Prices were consistent, but I do remember everything being out of stock for the period whenever the lockdown first happened.
Oh yeah, the whole toilet paper run thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of that was just panic buying.
We're sorry, but you can only purchase 4 bananas. The 5th banana is right out.
Afraid so. Yeah, a lot of stores had to implement restrictions just to deal with the panic buying. But the underlying economy actually handled it surprisingly well overall, and actually even international trade did pretty decent. It didn't really fall apart like some people were expecting it might, either due to supply side restrictions or due to government competition for scarce resources. Neither one of the doomsday scenarios ever really panned out, which we should be grateful for. That's a good thing. But inflation is one of the things we're watching right now. It's not really bad, so it could be that concerns over inflation spiraling out of control because of the huge increase in global demand coming are overwrought, but that is something that is being concerned, and that is something being discussed in markets right now. And the bond market in particular was acting squirrely a couple weeks ago due to inflation concerns. You don't want to be stuck with too many bonds if there's going to be a big spurt of inflation that eats into your real return. So some people have been moving out of bonds into other things. But for now, it's under control. It's just something to kind of keep on your radar. It could be something we talk about more later in the year if it really gets to be a problem. But for now, it doesn't seem to be. And, that's also a weird phenomena we've seen over the past 10, 15 years. Things that we would expect to be inflationary don't really cause all that much inflation. For example, after the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve and central banks all over the world implemented expansionary monetary policies. And the developed world central bank institutions in particular implemented what was called quantitative easing, which significantly increased money supply, de facto anyway. And there was a lot of concern that would cause significant inflation, and it never came. Even if you didn't think it would cause hyperinflation, you would have expected it to cause at least some inflation, but really it was very, very modest. And even the Fed, here in the United States was never even able to reach their target inflation rate. They don't want a lot of inflation, but they do want like some bare minimum. So that they can feel comfortable raising interest rates again, to try to get interest rates back to something resembling normal, but they never were able to really reach the target inflation rate, and so interest rates kind of stagnated at a very low rate because they just weren't entirely comfortable increasing them without that target inflation rate being hit. So that was very strange. And there's different theories as to why that happened and why it might happen again. One of them that I can remember off the top of my head is that inflation is being exported from the developed world into the developing world. All this demand that is created by new money supply or from other factors in the economy. A lot of that just gets exported, such that you don't see much export in the developed economy, but in developing markets where goods are being exported to the developed economy, increases in demand are felt much more significantly, such that prices actually do rise. And there is significant inflation around the developing world. It varies from place to place, but and in some cases like Argentina or Turkey, it has more to do with bad government policy than it does with market activity. But in general, you can see significantly more inflation with the developing world than you do in the developed world. And the suspicion is that the developed world might be partly causing that just with its own demand. That's one theory. Another theory, which is kind of similar, is that globalization over the past couple decades has reduced the cost of production and made it a lot easier to get away from reducing or significantly increasing prices. So it's kind of had a stabilizing effect on prices in the developed world. And as a result, things that would normally cause inflation are kind of more subdued, kind of mitigated by that factor. So those, also another idea is technology. It may just be that productive capacity and the technology of manufacturing has improved to the point where we can pretty easily increase production without needing to change prices a lot. It's just it may just be much easier now to respond to price signals and respond to them much faster, such that you don't see that much inflation or deflation even. So those are just different ideas. There's varying degrees of proof for each of them, but the point is that these factors or other factors or whatever it is that's mitigating inflation, those factors could still be in play, such that in 2021, even with all the expectations of inflation, we may not actually see it for the same reasons that we didn't see it, after 2008. But I also can't rule it out. So it's something that economists can't really predict. And this goes back to conversations we've had before about how much the global economy has changed, and just how much technology has changed the status quo. There's been a lot of structural economic change, and because it's so unprecedented, economists don't have a lot of data to work with in order to try to figure out how it works now. So it's kind of anybody's guess as to what really is going to happen in the global economy in the future. Even economists are not entirely sure. So it's something markets and economists and policymakers are all watching with great interest, because if there were a significant return of inflation, that would definitely upset a lot of apple carts. I think the general public in particular would be very surprised by that, because it's just been so long since there's been real inflation in the developed world. I think there's just a whole generation of people who have grown up without it, who would not really know how to deal with it if they encountered it again. So there would be a learning curve there that would probably be fairly disruptive. But that's all in the future. That's just stuff to watch, basically. Yeah, I think one of the things that I've read we talked a little bit about this last time. I was reading about the automotive industry and also the lumber industry. And both of those industries at the beginning of the pandemic expected that there would be a significant fall in demand. And, they were right, in the first couple months. And so with that expectation in mind, they laid off a bunch of people and they mothballed equipment and, this, that, and the other, just trying to cut costs in anticipation of the fall in revenue that they figured was coming. And they ended up being blindsided in the, I think, third or fourth quarter of 2020, when there was a big upsurge in demand that they just weren't expecting. And so the result of that is that they were caught off guard and that they're still kind of playing catch up. They're trying to get more capacity back online, and it's kind of a slow process. It's harder to get capacity back up than it is to draw it down. And so that's been another reason for shortages and inflation. Industries like the automotive market and the lumber, automotive industry and the lumber industry are still scaling back up their capital equipment from the drawdown early 2020. And they're still not quite up to snuff yet. They haven't quite increased production to meet demand yet. So that'll probably be an ongoing process, not only in those industries, but in others that kind of were caught in a similar conundrum. That just illustrates the importance of expectations, which something else we've talked about before. In the beginning, the expectation was that it wouldn't last very long. The pandemic wouldn't necessarily last very long, so they didn't necessarily need to worry about it. And then after a month or two, expectations changed again to being that it would be a long-term problem and that they needed to make significant adjustments. And then they got blindsided again when the vaccines were announced, and then there was a big upsurge in demand. And actually, there was an upsurge in demand even before the vaccines were announced. But I think it was the vaccines that really shifted market confidence back into positive territory. Because there was definitely much more optimism after that. So that surprise shift there in the third, fourth quarter also caught the industry off guard. So as expectations have whipsawed around, so too have industry planning. So it's kind of a mess, right now as a result. So the logistical problems aren't all that much of a surprise. Yeah, there's also problems with lockdowns. This is something I was reading that's been. This is something I was reading about that is specifically impacting the West Coast in particular. And apparently, it's just because California is much more of a lockdown state than it is a laissez-faire opening state.
Mm.
But one of the results of that is that Californian ports are not really operating at full capacity. They're not loading and unloading stuff as quickly as they would otherwise. And the result of that is that it's kind of strangling ingoing and outgoing port traffic. So all those container ships and whatnot that bring in all the stuff from, East Asia and other parts of the world, a lot of that stuff is kind of getting hung up in port. Or alternatively, ships are having to take alternative routes to go to other ports or, take other routes. So the result is that logistics in the U.S. are complicated, to put it mildly. It also doesn't help that there's a container shortage. This is something else I was reading about. Basically, this is kind of similar to the automotive and lumber industries. What happened early on in the pandemic is that there was obviously a significant collapse in international trade, and the result is that containers ended up kind of piling up in port because there wasn't really stuff to put in them. So stuff would be loaded in China or Japan or wherever, and then it would be brought over. But there wasn't a lot of stuff to be loaded up on the U.S. side, so they would just pile up empty containers and storage sites and whatnot. Well, now there's a big increase in demand for containers, correspondent with the increase in global trade. But because Californian ports are not operating at capacity, they haven't been able to they haven't been able to pull nearly enough containers out of storage in order to meet the demand for containers. So there's kind of an artificial shortage being imposed by the inability of labor and storage sites in California to unload all of these containers. And even now, the container problem is actually getting worse because there's still relatively subdued trade on the American side. So it's actually more profitable for you to load your ship in China, for example, bring all that stuff over, unload all the containers, and then just go right back to China without loading up anything on your ship when you're in the the United States, because then you can get back to China faster and load up again. There's just not really enough stuff here being sold into China to really justify waiting to load up with containers on the U.S. side. So containers are being brought in and just kind of left faster than the containers in storage are being brought out. And there's also containers that are being destroyed. There's a natural rate of attrition in the container market where old containers are scrapped. So that's also kind of undermining the return to equilibrium there. So long story short, inflation partly being pushed by global demand and logistical hurdles. We'll see how it all kind of plays out in 2021.
Did I tell you last week about that documentary that I wrote or watched about a bunch of different insurgent groups and stuff who were active in the DC riot and other stuff leading up to that, like the Michigan Capitol riot?
I don't think you did. You told me about the DRC one.
Okay, so this is a different one that I watched, and a lot of the stuff that these extremist groups were saying was about what their governor was doing in their state and what is or is not constitutional, and it kind of, to me, went back to a federalist versus anti-federalist question of how much power should a governor have of a state? Mm-hmm. And if a president disagrees with the governor, what can the governor actually do? And that's a question that a lot of them weren't really self-aware about, I think. And they were going to violent means, like, shooting up places. They bring guns to a lot of locations to kind of like exercise their Second Amendment right or whatever. But yeah, really not quite understanding what the role of the governor should be, and also just not practicing peaceful methodology for communicating your stance on stuff. There were a lot of overlap between people in the military and people in these groups. The Boogaloo Boys was one of the groups that was referenced a lot. They have a silly name and they wear Hawaiian shirts and stuff, but quite a few of them are ex-military, and they do like training and stuff with each other and are pretty yikes in terms of adding a lot of violence to what could otherwise be a protest or a rally that was nonviolent, like bashing in the windows and stuff of the Capitol in DC, that kind of thing. A lot of what's that other group, the Proud Boys or whatever, a lot of the key members of those organizations were present there. And yeah, it's a really interesting piece overall, but it seems like these groups were very pro-Trump and looking for more of an authoritarian kind of government from the federal point of view, where if the federal government says something, the states shouldn't be able to contest that at all, which seemed like a pretty different stance than a lot of libertarians would have. A lot of libertarians, I think, like states' rights, and they want states' rights to be pretty strong because maybe their state is different from the federal government and they want to still be a part of the US and have those benefits, but also not to have all the states be identical to each other. And that's a balance where it's pretty much impossible to please everybody. It's going to be some compromise where people who are on the far end, either side, either very pro-federalist or very anti-federalist, are going to have some stuff to be upset about. But you were mentioning California and the ports, and it made me think about how California has done things very differently than South Dakota has. And as an American citizen, you can move from state to state, and there's not really too much paperwork involved in that. Whenever I moved from Austin up here to Seattle, I didn't have to tell the government first. Basically just gave my notice at the apartment I was at, and I sorted out a lease for the new place, and I had to update my mailing address and stuff for voting purposes and update my driver's license. But aside from that, it's pretty fluid moving from state to state. So that's an interesting thing that every country has a different extent of, is how strong is the federal government as opposed to local government and state or province government.
Yeah, it is kind of an awkward moment for libertarianism, between populism and all the other sort of tensions in U.S. society right now. From what I was reading, libertarians are pretty split on Trump. Mm-hmm. There are some who think he's kind of a net positive or even just a pure positive, and then there's others who are deeply skeptical. So it's kind of riven that whole political bloc. Yeah, I think different people have different feelings about kind of what to do about the direction the U.S. is taking and what to do about problems in the U.S. And, like you point out, there is kind of a counterintuitive perspective among some that the feds should be able to kind of move in on state powers where it kind of suits them. Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the U.S. who don't really know much about how our political system actually works. But it were otherwise. But one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that people get some pretty wild-assed ideas about how they think it works. And they can sometimes turn to extremism as a result.
Yeah, I did direct message you the documentary link on Discord.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
It's called American Insurrection, PBS Frontline. Okay. It is age-gated as well, so you probably have to log in on YouTube because it does have some beat-em-ups and more violent situations.
That's not very libertarian.
Well, these groups are, I would say, foremost violent extremists before they're any particular like political ideology. Because it's like the assessment of what you believe is one thing, and then how you go about representing that would be the execution of whatever your political affiliation might be. And these are specifically the people who are toting guns around and actively involved in shooting people and breaking stuff. Which it's kind of interesting because we've talked about the decline in violence and the effort to put more faith in institutions and to try to be less corrupt in that process of deciding things using votes and pencil and paper, maybe fancy pens and penmanship, as opposed to which group can beat up the other group to establish what the rule is going to be.
Yeah.
And the Capitol riots, some people's emotion, like the people who are there, they felt like their heart was in the right place and that they were fighting for something that they perceived to be democratic, when in actuality, democracy is all about being able to communicate using your language and your beliefs and desires, as opposed to like grabbing stuff by violent means, because that would be more bandit rule.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of the problem is just kind of ties into the decentralization of politics, or the democratization of politics, if you want to be fancy. Technology makes it easier than ever to participate, or at least think you're participating in politics. And one of the changes is that there's really much less involvement by organizations in politics. It used to be that people would make associations, committees, local institutions of one sort or another, by which they would work as a community to involve themselves in politics. But now it's much more atomized. It's much more of an individual effort. And that kind of manifests itself as these sort of flash movements on Twitter, where there'll be a popular hashtag and then people rally around it. And then that kind of becomes a sort of weird social media movement. Black Lives Matter kind of started that way. And there's a similar phenomena on the right with some of these groups like the Boogaloo Boys and whatnot that kind of just start online on social media, but don't really have a greater hierarchy to them. There's no institutionalization by which they operationalize their political preferences into what would represent traditional political participation.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's much more just have a random protest here, have a random protest there, just kind of be very vocal and try to exert political pressure by being visible rather than by negotiating with political actors through some kind of institution or representative. It's one of the major changes, not only in U.S. politics, but in just Western democratic politics in general. It's the same phenomenon you can see just about anywhere, really.
Yeah, that makes me think of the general question a person could have, which is, I have a strong opinion about something and I want to push for change. Where do I go to do that?
Yeah.
That's a question that honestly I don't know the best answer to, because you're talking to some local person about it. Who is that person in my area and how do I contact them based on the issue that I'm having? Mm-hmm. It's also not something that's part of, I think, standard school curriculum, which seems like a big whoops. Maybe should have done that. Like a simple high school class of, okay, you have this thing that you think is an important political issue in your municipality. This is who you would talk to and how you would go about kind of making a change there using the systems that are in place. Because even if you don't like the systems that are in place, there should be people you can reach out to about whatever your grievance or issue might be in a peaceful and democratic kind of approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for those of you who are not from the United States, I can tell we've got a few based off of our geolocation chart here. In the United States, we actually do have courses in high school that teach about American government. It's generally called government or something like that, but it's very cursory. It's just very basic. They really don't teach you. They teach you roughly how the system works and different branches of government and that kind of stuff. But they really don't operationalize it much. They don't really tell you like, okay, so this is what this means. They don't show you the system and then show you how to use the system, how to participate in the system. They just kind of leave it to you to figure it out or leave it to your parents to explain it to you. So there's some logic in that, in so much as, people are very partisan in the United States. So there's almost invariably somebody who would be upset if you explained it in one way as opposed to another. But the downside is that a lot of American students leave high school without really knowing much about actual political participation. They know roughly how it's supposed to work, but not actually what they're supposed to do.
Mm.
So that is definitely an area where we could serve to improve significantly. That ranks up there with things like financial literacy and internet literacy, stuff like that, which high schools in the U.S. also do a piss poor job of educating students.
With Twitter and social media, it also highlights the speed that you can get something out there and done that might not be the most official channel, but there's the community justice kind of thing of someone did something bad. You could go to authorities about it and move it through that process, which is rigorous, not always perfect, and it's slow. Or you can post to social media and potentially get a whole bunch of clicks and get some traction in the issue really fast. It's not the official kind of this is how you pursue justice route, but people get the result really fast doing that. So you see that a lot. Like there was a YouTuber who's very, very famous who had another social media person come out with a story of him assaulting her, and that's going to be something that affects him a lot faster. It's a way for her to get her voice out there and that kind of thing. So we're definitely in a very different era when it comes to that kind of thing. And it affects me in the sense of the way that I conduct myself is basically in such a way that I pretty much always have a mic open on accident. I'm just prepared for that because I feel like the concept of having totally private channels and communications doesn't really exist anymore. There's also the aspect of if you do stuff off platform, say I'm a Twitch streamer and I do some stuff that is really bad and Twitch doesn't like, they can take action against me and my account for doing that. So it's all kind of interconnected. Your behavior counts everywhere, which some people don't like, but if you look at it another way, having consistency in your behavior is good. If you're going to behave one way with your brand, you should probably also like try to be a good person as well. So
yeah,
I can see people's problems with that, but it's what we have to deal with now. This is the new metagame.
Let's see, what else did we have? I guess that all just came out of your opening question about how the economy is doing.
Mm-hmm.
We got some leverage out of that.
Yeah, you were talking about the boats and the ships, and I was thinking about the people who are unhappy with their governor, and then we went on a fun goose chase.
Well, let's see. What was there anything else that kind of caught your eye that you really wanted to get into, or did you just want to jump right into the defiled desk?
The defiled desk.
Yeah, that was one of the stories I kind of touched on just briefly at the end of the last time we did this.
Mm-hmm.
It's we didn't have time for it, but I did mention that in Australia desks are being defiled. We didn't have time to get to it then, but I'm sure we can find some time for it today.
How defiled?
Very defiled.
Like in a gross kind of way?
Yeah. Australia has been having some issues with the behavior of staffers over there. And it's actually a much broader issue than the desks. I kind of make fun of it. It has to do with sexual assault, harassment, and other just sort of general sexual misbehavior. And it actually came out of well, I shouldn't say it came out of, but the whole issue kind of stemmed from a whistleblower who kind of came out and talked to media about it and gave them some evidence. And he talked about how there's just constant complaints coming in, from people complaining about misbehavior on the part of the staffers and government officials. And one of the things he showed media was a picture and a video. They both came from the same guy, and this guy sent him a picture. He didn't explain why. Just he just said that this guy sent me a picture, and he was a staffer. In what was it? What's the capital of Australia? Canberra. So he was a staffer in Canberra, and he took a picture of himself pointing at a desk. It was the desk of a female minister of parliament, whom was not there. Nobody else was in the office. He was just there himself, and he just sent this guy a picture of him pointing at the desk. So then the next thing he sends him is a video of him ejaculating on the desk. Again, no particular reason. Like there doesn't seem to be any logic behind it. He just kind of did it. And apparently stuff like that is not that unusual. So this guy came out to the media, and now there's kind of been a big uproar in Australia about misbehavior of this sort. There's also been rape accusations, sexual harassment accusations. Some of them predate the whistleblower, though. It's kind of been something that's been on a slow burn for a month or two, and now it's kind of really come out into the open in Australian media. One of the goofy ones was the whistleblower also talked about the chapel room in the government building. Yeah, apparently not a lot of people have actually been praying in the chapel room, Neuro. You can probably guess what they have been doing.
Gross stuff?
Yes, gross stuff. So Australia's been in a tizzy over that.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty fucked up.
Yeah, I don't, obviously other stuff is going on in Australia. They've got the whole trade war with China and whatnot, but the big thing in the news that I was reading about was this whole issue regarding staff misbehavior. So that was that story. We didn't have time for last time, but I'm happy we were able to squeeze that in and update people on the shenanigans in Australia. But other than that, was there anything that you wanted to touch on?
I don't think anything really jumped at me too much this week aside from that documentary I saw, which was worth a watch, I think.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that. I think oh wait, did I not get it? No, there it is. Okay. Well, let's see. If we don't have anything in particular we want to get into here, then maybe I can get in some corrections.
Sure.
That would be all right with you. And I guess I'll just make the usual disclaimer now. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, obviously. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, Chad is encouraged to correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So, please do let me know. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will look at it later. So, participation is encouraged. So let's see. So corrections. Let's see. Last time we were talking a lot about South America last time, and I kept talking about Chavista parties in different countries, but I didn't actually know the names of the parties. I just knew that they were Chavista in nature. So I went back and tried to look up the actual names here, just to kind of give you, just to kind of share them with you. In Bolivia, it's the Movement for Socialism. Yeah, that's Evo Morales' party. In Venezuela, it's the Fifth Republic movement. In Ecuador, it's the Proud and Sovereign Homeland Alliance, which is apparently a play on words, because apparently in Spanish, país means country. So it's basically Country Alliance if you use the acronym. In Nicaragua, it's the Sandinista National Liberation Front, which kind of surprised me. I didn't know they were still around. Let's see. Oh, yeah, that was all of them. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there so you don't have to listen to me just talk about Chavista parties of one sort or another, generically. Also a correction on the Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan. Last time I said that he had been convicted of murder, and that actually was not true. He was convicted and jailed for kidnapping, but not murder. Let's see. And also, we talked a little bit about Suriname. I had said that the only thing I could remember about them... Well, no, I said that the only thing I could remember about Guyana was that they had elected as president somebody who had been convicted of murder. I didn't quite have that right. I was actually thinking of Suriname, not Guyana. And he was not convicted of murder per se. The actual truth here is actually more interesting than the details I could remember last time. The guy's name is Bouters. He's 74 years old, and he was actually dictator of Suriname in the 1980s. And that's sort of where the murder thing came from. He was accused of having ordered the murder of a number of dissidents who had been imprisoned in Suriname. So that's where the murder allegations come from. They were called the December murders. And he admitted political responsibility for them, apparently, quote unquote, in 2007. But he denied personal responsibility. In other words, kind of sort of responsible, but not enough to go to jail responsible. Basically his logic. Let's see. So there was a trial that started in 2007 as well. And 12 years later, in 2019, he was found guilty of murder. And he was supposed to serve 20 years in jail, but no arrest warrant was actually ever issued. So he was found guilty of murder, but he was never jailed for it. And probably will not be jailed for it, it seems. There was another conviction that was not murder. He was convicted in 1999 in the Netherlands, actually, for smuggling more than 1,000 pounds of cocaine. He was sentenced in absentia to 11 years in prison for that one. Obviously, he didn't go to jail for that either, since I imagine he fled the Netherlands. Probably never showed up to court, but technically convicted of drug trafficking there. He denies the allegations completely, but that kind of goes without saying. So yeah, those are the details there. I think he had been president for a couple of terms up until 2020, but apparently he lost the presidency in 2020, so he is no longer in power. I think. But yeah, those are the corrections. I just wanted to kind of throw those out there.
Wait, so you're saying you're not correct about everything the first time you say it?
Oh God, no.
Oh.
Unfortunately not.
I did notice earlier there was a question if you knew much about personal finance. It was fairly broad, so don't really know exactly what they wanted to know, but just like general stuff about stocks and bonds, which I don't think is your area of expertise.
No, I don't have a background in finance. And, going by the state of my own personal finances, I'm probably not the guy you want to ask about them. Yeah, I mean, the only stuff I could tell you is like really basic stuff, like, try to save money, try to be frugal when you can, have a diverse portfolio, I guess. Not just stocks, but also stocks, bonds, what have you. Yeah, you can probably get a broker to just kind of do that for you. And if you're young and just starting out, I think you're supposed to be relatively risk tolerant. And then when you get older, you're supposed to be more risk averse. And that's relevant because that kind of helps determine the design of your portfolio. If you're more risk seeking, you're generally going to have more stocks and more interesting securities in your portfolio. If you're more risk averse, it's going to be more stuff like bonds and other fixed income assets, stuff like that. This is not professional financial advice. Needless to say, don't take this too seriously. Yeah, don't be like people on Wall Street bets.
What about cryptocurrency?
What about cryptocurrency? I don't know about. I'm still not sold on it personally. I'm still pretty skeptical. I think the underlying technology is going to get used more. I think that's pretty useful, but I still kind of see cryptocurrency as being more of just a commodity trade.
Mm-hmm.
People kind of invest in it to hedge against inflation, kind of like they do with gold in a way. Mm-hmm. Although with cryptocurrency, I think the properties are going to be different. So, I mean, you'd have to talk to somebody who's really looked at the data in order to kind of infer how cryptocurrencies behave under different market conditions. So I can't say definitively that it behaves like a commodity all the time, but in general, that's been my impression when I read about it.
Yeah, there's the blockchain technology, which is its own thing, which I can't really explain to you in great detail, but I know that it's a thing. And then there's the specific cryptocurrency types, which you're saying it's commodity trades. It's kind of like Pokemon card trading, where based on what people think is the coolest, the price will go up or the value will go up. And then as it kind of is less cool and maybe Dogecoin is the best or Onion Coin, those will spike up. But it doesn't really seem like its own thing that you're actually investing in that grows on its own.
Mm-hmm.
It's just what people feel to be valuable at different times.
Yeah.
Holographic Charizard, it's crap. People don't even go for that anymore. It's all about the holographic Venusaur right now. Okay.
It's funny you mentioned that, though, that you use that analogy. Have you heard of this? Have you heard of non-fungible tokens?
No.
Yeah, the acronym is NFT, and it's this weird sort of blockchain thing. It's not a currency. It's basically almost a contract in which you are publicly recognized as owning the intellectual property of some intangible good. So people have actually been selling tweets that as NFTs. You know, you basically can actually buy the intellectual property for a given tweet and just technically own that. And your ownership is proven by way of the public blockchain. It's very strange. And it's kind of a new market. There's been a lot of money that's been pumped into it over the past year or two. Apparently, there's been some growth there. From what I've read of it, it sounds kind of like the art market, where people kind of just buy weird shit because they have money to burn, or just kind of as a conspicuous consumption or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't remember who the guy was who founded Twitter, the original owner of the company. I don't remember his name, but he actually sold the first ever tweet on Twitter, which was by himself. He posted that. He sold that as an NFT, so somebody actually owns that. So you can't actually use that intellectual property wise.
Could someone resell the first tweet that was sold to them?
Apparently they can, because it's all blockchain, so it would all be recorded publicly.
That, with how much information is out there, that kind of seems like selling the stars in the sky, which some people have tried to do. They'll like point to a star, they'll be like, do you want to buy that one? We'll say that's yours and put your name on it. Yeah, I want to buy that star. And it's like, how can you capitalize on that in any way aside from telling people that that's yours?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I did read that there's some debate about just how enforceable the contract would actually be in practice. But I don't think that really matters all that much to the people doing the buying. I think they just kind of like the novelty of owning NFTs of one sort or another. Just kind of a funky new market that was produced by cryptocurrency. And you mentioned Pokemon and, gathering different Pokemon, and NFTs are kind of like that in a way, kind of go out and just gather the tweets or whatever it is they're selling, whatever it is you like, you can kind of hunt that down and buy it and technically own it in so much as you can own such things.
Well, back in my day, if I saw something that I thought was cool, I would screenshot it and it would be saved as a file on my computer. And that didn't cost any money at all.
Back in the good old days.
Yeah.
We didn't have NFTs, we had right-click save.
Yeah. Pretty wild concept. I guess that technology was lost.
Sadly so. Back in the before times.
Just like they lost LAN support for StarCraft. That's so goofy.
Does it not work anymore?
Well, they prevented it from working, but I just make the joke that it was like a kind of like Greek fire, some really awesome technology that was just lost. It was on some computer of how to set up a LAN, and they could never reestablish it. There would be more piracy of the game, but it's free to play now, so it's kind of like, well, you stealing free shit. What?
How strange. I hadn't known that they'd done that.
Yeah, StarCraft 2 is all hosted on servers somewhere, which if there's a major tournament, they'll just host a local server there, but Blizzard, or I think now ESL, they still have a sort of hand in it that makes it not truly LAN, where you're not truly just hooking up the computers and having them talk to each other. There's some third party involved.
Well, that's certainly a stark contrast from the first StarCraft.
Yep.
That was pretty much all LANs all the time, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The more things change, the more they don't stay the same in this case, I guess. Maybe not the best quote. Let's see, I had a bunch of stuff on the Middle East for you, if you're up for it.
Sure.
They've been quite active over the past few months. Let's see, did you want to start? Yeah, let's start with Iran. They've been quite busy. So do you remember anything about the nuclear deal issue that's been going on?
No.
Well, we can start kind of from the beginning on that. You know, basically, Iran had a nuclear program originally, I think, back in the 80s. You know, a long time ago. But they never really were able to go anywhere with it. And I think they largely dismantled it in the 1990s. I think there were intelligence reports to that effect. So that kind of changed with the onset of the Bush administration, and more specifically the war on terror. Obviously, at that point, the Bush administration kind of had it in for Iran. And so the Iranian government kind of got concerned about that, and they started looking more into their nuclear program, looking more at developing an actual nuclear weapon. So the nuclear weapons program started up again, you know, sometime early mid-aughts or so. And the result of that was, once the US found out about it, they started applying a lot of pressure. And there was a big push in the latter part of the Bush administration and through the Obama administration to reach some kind of deal in which the Iranian government would give up its nuclear weapons program in exchange for unspecified concessions of one sort or another. In the meantime, the United States kind of piled on sanction after sanction on Iran in order to try to deter them from continuing on course to get a nuclear weapon, which was not really working, which was another reason the US wanted to reach some kind of negotiated settlement. And the Obama administration, in the Obama administration's second term, in particular, pushed very hard to reach a deal with Iran. You know, I mean, if you lived through that period, you probably remember hearing about it a lot. It was in the news pretty frequently. And there was a lot of, you know, pushing and pulling and negotiating and posturing, and it just kind of dragged out for years. And they finally reached an agreement, I think, in like 2015, maybe 2016. I don't quite remember exactly, but they were finally able to put it together. Now, it was not just a bilateral deal between the United States and Iran. It was actually a multilateral deal that involved the United States, Iran, and also Europe, specifically, I think, the UK, France, and Germany, and also Russia, China, and I think maybe India. I don't quite remember if India was in there, but basically some of the major purchasers of Iranian oil were all kind of involved there. And the agreement that was reached was a little bit soft. You know, basically the deal was that there would be sanctions relief. The sanctions that have been placed on Iran would be relaxed over time. And in exchange, the Iranian government would have to do a couple of things. They would have to adhere to a schedule of de-escalation, for one. Two, they would have to allow inspectors into their nuclear facilities and allow surveillance equipment to be set up in their nuclear facilities, which the IAEA would have access to. And they also committed to not enrich uranium beyond a certain point. I think it was 3.67% purity. That was the maximum that they were supposed to be allowed to enrich uranium.
So basically, if you're going to make nukes, we have to watch you do it, and you have to use crappy ones.
Well, they can't build nukes with 367%. It's actually impossible. They need something like 90+% enriched uranium
Mm.
in order to build nuclear weapons. And they also need a certain amount. I don't remember. I don't think I have that in my notes. But there's a certain amount of 90+% enriched uranium that they need in order to build nuclear weapons. And they were bound by the agreement not to enrich uranium anywhere near 90%, again, 3.67%. And I think they were also bound not to enrich beyond a certain amount as well. So there was also a quantitative side to the deal. Again, I don't have that in my notes, so I apologize, but I believe that was part of it. Now, what happened is that the deal was implemented, accordingly at first. Everything kind of went according to plan. But there was a lot of skepticism of how useful the deal actually was. Because the problem for the United States, as well as for other countries, is that by agreeing to relax sanctions, they lost one of their principal tools by which to influence Iran. And they wanted to influence Iran because Iran was going out of its way to influence the Middle East. So while it's true that Iran was adhering to the nuclear agreement, they were also doing a lot of other stuff that the West didn't like interfering in the Syrian civil war, developing ballistic missiles, which hypothetically in the future could carry a nuclear warhead, as well as supporting insurgent groups and paramilitary groups in different countries around the Middle East. So none of that was really good from the perspective of the West, certainly not from the perspective of Israel. And there was a desire to do something about it, but what can they really do if they can't use sanctions? The nuclear deal kind of bound their hands on that. So the criticism is that while the nuclear deal may have dealt with the nuclear problem, it didn't deal with any of the other problems that Iran was involved in the Middle East, and so was a net negative for Middle Eastern stability. I think another one of the criticisms was that the nuclear deal did not really explicitly prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon in the long run, because the nuclear deal was actually only supposed to last about 10 years, I think. Something like that. It had like a sunset clause in it, beyond which it would no longer be in effect. And hypothetically, then all Iran would have to do is wait out the 10 years and then just start up its program again. And technically, that would have been legal, under the terms of the deal anyway. So a lot of people were critical on that point specifically. I think the hope on the part of the Obama administration and other involved parties is that by the time 10 years had passed, tensions between the US and Iran would have mitigated sufficiently such that the Iranian government would no longer really want to develop nuclear weapons. So then Trump got elected in 2016. So a lot of those implicit assumptions behind the deal ended up getting thrown right out the window. Obviously, tensions between the US and Iran ramped up considerably under the Trump administration, not least because the Trump administration pulled the US out of the nuclear deal completely. So the Iranian government, needless to say, was very upset about that because that meant renewed sanctions on the part of the United States. Now, the Iranians had hoped that the other countries involved in the deal would not also apply sanctions again. The United States was not the only one before the deal was implemented. Other countries also were implementing their own sanctions. Those were dropped when the deal was implemented. But with the US backing out of the deal, there was a danger for Iran that China, Europe, etc., would also reimpose sanctions. And so they hoped they would not. They hoped everybody other than the US would try to stick with the deal. And that's actually what they said they would do. The Chinese government, European governments, etc., all of them said that they would stick with the deal and not reimpose sanctions, and that they opposed the United States leaving the deal. Here's the problem. The United States, under the Trump administration, imposed what are called secondary sanctions. So the sanctions not only targeted Iran, but also targeted anybody in another country that did business with Iran. Now, what that meant is that European firms in particular who wanted to do business with Iran could not do it without being locked out of the US market. And because Europe's economy is so tightly integrated with the US economy, very few companies were willing to make that sacrifice. Whatever the morality or ethics of the situation, if a European company has to choose between the US market and the Iranian market, it just kind of makes more sense mathematically and economically to go with the larger market, that being the United States. So, even though European governments in particular said that they would stick with the deal, in effect, they ended up reimposing sanctions de facto by way of the secondary American sanctions. And European governments tried to get around those sanctions. They tried to set up like an alternative clearance institution that would be able to clear deals between European firms and Iranian firms. That was basically a way of getting around the SWIFT banking system. But that didn't work, because the problem was not access to SWIFT. The problem was wanting to avoid getting sanctioned by the United States. They want to maintain access to the American market, and that's what was being threatened. So even if you can clear your deal through a SWIFT alternative, you've still got to worry about the United States finding out and then losing all your US business. So Europe was not able to keep their word that they would try to maintain business ties with Iran, even though the United States has left the deal. So the Iranian government was very upset about that, obviously. And so as a result, around, I want to say 2019, the Iranian government really started feeling pressure from within Iran. There was a big political fight within Iran between the reformist faction in government, led by the Prime Minister Rouhani, and the Hawks, which were basically led by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So these people are basically nationalists who don't trust the West, don't trust the United States, and they want to have a very aggressive, hawkish posture in Iranian foreign policy. So the Rouhani government is the one that negotiated the deal for Iran. They're the ones who were basically elected by the people to reach a deal. That was actually one of the big campaign platform points for Rouhani when he was running for office. He was able to achieve that, but with the United States out of the deal and sanctions reapplied and the Iranian economy tumbling again, he felt a lot of pressure from his right on the political spectrum. And as a result, Iranian foreign policy became much more aggressive. That was one of the few ways that they felt that they could kind of counter the American pressure. Obviously, they can't really go to war with the United States. They would lose. But they can't really do much of anything else either. So the Rouhani government originally wanted to just sort of make threats, but they didn't really have much that they could threaten with. Now, the Hawks, in contrast, wanted to directly confront the United States with, what's the word I want? Not tipping point, but not edging tactics. Brinksmanship, that's the word I want. They wanted to engage in a policy of brinksmanship, where they would basically do things that made it look like they were considering conflict or considering attacking the United States, but then not actually doing it, basically just to ramp up tensions. And I think everybody kind of remembers the high-profile stuff the Iranian government did as part of this policy change. They attacked a couple oil tankers in the Gulf. They either themselves or helped the Houthis attack a Saudi oil refinery, which was within the boundaries of Saudi Arabia. A pretty bold attack. And there was, incidents with gunboats and whatnot, just sort of little things like that as well. So in general, there was more confrontation in the Gulf, some more violence. I think there was some limpet mines were involved. Those seems to be very popular over there right now.
What mines?
Limpet mines. Basically they're mines that you can attach to the side of a ship, and they'll detonate after a certain amount of time. So
sticky bombs.
Yeah, like big sticky bombs. So the Iranian government shifted its foreign policy to be more hawkish in this way. And the hope is that the United States government would be sufficiently intimidated that it would give some concessions within the nuclear deal. Now, this sort of escalation in tension sort of reached its crescendo in January of 2020. And I think everybody kind of remembers what happened then. That was when the Trump administration, the United States had some bases that were rocketed by some Iraqi paramilitary groups linked to Iran. So the United States, under the Trump administration, responded by assassinating the head of the IRGC, or maybe, yeah, I think it was the head of the IRGC. That was Omar Soleimani. And also, sometimes people forget the U.S. also assassinated some of the heads of some of the local major Iranian-linked Iraqi militias. So there's actually I mean, several eggs in one basket, basically. Multiple assassinations with one missile. So that kind of sparked a war scare. There was a lot of people online. You know how Reddit gets. Everybody hyperventilates when things like this happen. So people were talking about World War III and this, that, and the other, and being drafted and all this sort of nonsense. That was always hyperbole, but there was a chance that there could be an escalation in conflict between the United States and Iran. So Iran responded by basically going on high alert, and that didn't go well for them because they ended up accidentally shooting down an airliner, mostly filled with Iranian students, no less. And as for the United States, they just kind of backed off. There was an Iranian retaliation in the form of the ballistic missiles that Iran fired at an airbase that hosted some U.S. personnel, but nobody was killed, and both sides basically backed off at that point. So from there, Iran's policy of brinksmanship was largely abandoned. There was kind of a sense that things were too risky and that they really didn't want to risk there was a sense that tensions had grown too hot and that any further escalation would risk a conflict that they would probably get the poor end of. So after that, the Iranian government kind of went back to negotiations and started leaning more on threats. Now, one of the things that coincided with the brinksmanship strategy was threatening to enrich more uranium than was allowed under the deal. And basically, at every stage of that, basically every couple months, the Iranian government would declare that they were going to enrich it a little bit more. Now, up until recently, they had only done up to 4.5%, which is not a whole lot higher than the 367 purity cap that had been agreed under the deal, but it was technically higher. And I would also add that they had technically also been producing more in terms of quantity than they were allowed to produce. So that was another cheat that they did in order to try to pressure the United States as well as the other remaining members of the nuclear deal into offering some concessions. Let's see, I think wait, there was another detail there. And it slipped my mind. So that's pretty much been the tit for tat since then. Brinksmanship has been abandoned, and every so often the Iranian government announces that they're going to breach the deal in some new, more extreme way. And more recently, I think in like February or so, 2021, the Iranian government passed a new law that conditionally required the production and storage of at least 120 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium annually for quote-unquote peaceful purposes. Now, this is a significant escalation because, again, they hadn't done any more than 4.5% as of 2019 and 2020. So going up to 20% and making 120 kilograms of it, that's a significant escalation. Now, to be fair to the Iranians, this was done specifically in response to the assassination of a top nuclear scientist, Mohsen. I'm going to butcher his name here, so I apologize. The scientist's name was Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And the suspicion is that he was assassinated by the Israelis. There's no proof, but most likely that is the case. Let's see. And there was some proof that they had actually started to enrich uranium to 20% at their Fordo site. Fordo is a city where they, one of the sites in Iran where they do the enrichment. So this is something that, this is not an idle threat. This is a threat that they've actually, they're actually following through on. The law did come with a condition, which is that if sanctions on the country's oil and financial sectors were eased within 2 months, then they would back off and maybe return to the deal. So that was sort of their condition there, to try to pressure the West into offering more concessions on that. Let's see. Now, this is the key thing right here. This is an important data point that I found. 120 kilograms of uranium enriched to 20% is about half of the amount of uranium necessary for one nuclear bomb.
So they do that twice and they have one bomb.
Yes. Now, you also still have to enrich it to 90%. You can't just have 20%.
Mm-hmm.
But I read that that's actually very easy. Apparently, I'm reading from my notes here, so bear with me. Going from uranium's natural state, a 0.7% concentration of U-235, to 20% takes about 90% of the total effort required to get to weapons grade uranium. So the hard part is going from 0.7% enrichment to 20% enrichment. That's apparently like, again, 90% of the total effort. After that, going from, say, 20% to 90 plus percent, that apparently is very, very easy. At that point, the only problem is producing the quantity that you need. Again, apparently about 240 kilograms. So it may not sound like much for Iran to threaten to enrich to 20%, but that's actually more significant than you think, because enriching to 20%, that's, again, most of the effort they need to get to a nuclear weapon. So this is getting Iran closer to what's called a nuclear breakout. That's sort of a phrase that emerged during the negotiation of the original nuclear deal. And the idea there, this is something pointed out by critics of the deal. The idea was that if Iran did not significantly curtail or outright remove its capacity to enrich uranium, then they could just very slowly and secretly build up their reserve and get to a point where it would be very easy for them to rush production of a nuclear weapon. Again, that's why it's called a breakout. They would be breaking out over the course of maybe 6 months to a nuclear weapon. And so that's why critics really wanted the US government to be much more harsh in the conditions that were imposed by the nuclear deal. They thought that it was not really sufficient to deter Iran from building up a secret stockpile and putting itself in a position where it could very, very quickly get a nuclear weapon if it wanted to. Now, keeping Iran away from nuclear breakout was one of the big objectives of the nuclear deal. Not just keeping them away from nuclear weapons in general, but trying to make sure that Iranian capacity to produce and enrich uranium was at a point where it was nowhere near nuclear breakout. But again, criticism was that they didn't go far enough, and if Iran goes through with this enrichment to 20%, that would put them very close to a nuclear breakout capacity. And at that point, we would be only maybe 6 months or so away from a nuclear bomb, an Iranian nuclear bomb. So this is very serious then. This is a very serious escalation in tension between Iran and the United States. This isn't like what it was before in 2019 or in 2020, where it was kind of incremental, slow escalations by one side or the other. Now this is a significant step function in terms of the confrontation. Let's see, there's also a new law in the Iranian parliament that puts an end to the IAEA's inspection of the country's nuclear facilities. So now inspections have been blocked outright. It also mandated the blocking of UN inspectors from Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz and Fordow. So that's another leg of the agreement that's been pushed out there. Let's see. So specific steps, just to kind of reiterate what we've been talking about, specific steps that Iran has taken has included building up the stockpile of low enriched uranium, producing 4.5% plus enriched uranium, possibly up to 20%. As of now, they've restarted advanced centrifuges. That was another escalation that they did earlier. And they've also resumed enrichment activities at Fordow. Again, that was part of the 20% threat. And also to reiterate, the Iranian government says that all of this is, quote, fully reversible upon full compliance by all parties, end quote, to the deal. That was Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif who issued that statement. Also, the Iranians started producing uranium metal. Inspectors, before they got kicked out, verified the existence of 3.6 grams of uranium metal at a facility in Isfahan. So let's see, that's kind of where we are now. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the respective positions of the US and Iran. The Biden administration says that it's not quite ready to return to the nuclear deal, basically in recognition that there are other problems in the Middle East that it wants to use sanctions for. So I suspect that they're going to want a negotiated settlement, but it's going to be a much more broad and all-encompassing settlement, I think, than the old nuclear deal. Let's see. And the supreme, what is it? The Ayatollah of Iran, basically the supreme leader of Iran, like I said before, is significantly escalating things by threatening to escalate to 20%, to enrich to 20%. But also, he's also more recently threatened to enrich up to 60% if the country needed it, quote unquote, which would definitely put them, well into breakout territory. But all of that is, again, conditioned on return to the nuclear deal, which the Iranian government is receptive to. And let's see, I had 3 updates on this in my notes. Let's see. Oh, right. The Europeans have been trying to facilitate negotiations between the United States and Iran. It wasn't really working at first. The Iranians kind of turned their nose up at it and said that they didn't trust the United States, etc. So the initial offer to mediate talks didn't go anywhere. Later on, the Iranian Foreign Ministry announced that Iran would begin enriching uranium to 60% purity. Again, that's one of the most recent threats. That was in response to an attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility over the weekend. Actually, that was 2 weeks ago, I think. That was probably an Israeli cyber attack of one sort or another. That's the suspicion. Let's see. And yeah. Oh, no, that was a new one. That's actually just in the past week or so. There was a quote-unquote terrorist attack. It's not clear what that was. But that was targeting one of their facilities one of their centrifuge facilities that was producing advanced uranium. So that project was shut down. The suspicion is that it was the Israelis again. The Israeli government has been very active over this. They're very concerned about the Iranians enriching uranium closer and closer to a nuclear breakout threshold. So they've been escalating their confrontations, shall we say, with Iran. But in the meantime, the Iranian government has actually issued some hints, some signals that it's actually ready to start negotiations as mediated by Europe. It's a little goofy. They refuse to meet face-to-face with the American negotiators. So the European diplomats are having to do some shuttle diplomacy. They literally have to go from one hotel to the other. They have the Iranians set up in one hotel, the Americans in another. So the European delegation will talk with one side, and then they'll basically drive over to the other hotel with the other party, and then back and forth like that until they reach some kind of deal. It's a somewhat laborious process, but for whatever reason, the Ayatollah of Iran forbid Iranian negotiators from meeting face-to-face with the American negotiators. So that's kind of how they have to do it. So that's pretty much where we are now. The Iranians have, in response to attacks by Israel, basically, threatened to enrich uranium up to 60%, and there's some evidence that they've started to do that. And if they do that, that would put them in a nuclear breakout threshold where they could get a bomb within, a matter of months, basically. And at that point, the United States and especially Israel would be faced with a very stark choice about how to deal with that. Because if you don't do anything, then pretty good chance that they'll get it. Obviously, the Iranian government feels very threatened by the West and the United States in particular. So getting a nuclear bomb would definitely do a lot for their national security. But the United States is just as uncomfortable with Iran having a bomb. And so they're going to be very tempted to take pretty strong action if the Iranians do get to a 60% level. I think from the signals I've been seeing in the news, I think both Iran and the United States are pretty keen on a deal. So I think we can be kind of optimistic on that. But there is a danger that hawks in either the United States or in Israel or in the United States may sabotage things. So we could end up falling into conflict anyway. And, when I say conflict, I don't mean like an invasion. We've talked before about what a war between Iran and the United States would look like. It would mostly be an air war. It would mostly be the United States trying to bomb nuclear facilities and whatnot and trying to destroy Iran's capacity to develop nuclear weapons. And the Iranians, in return, would be using their paramilitary allies in places like Lebanon and Iraq to attack various American interests of one sort or another. and probably also using missiles and missile boats in the Gulf to try to threaten the U.S. Navy. So it would be a lot of missiles and bombings and cruise missiles, that kind of thing, more so than an Iraq-style invasion where we go and occupy the country. I don't think that's even really feasible for the United States, at least not with a country the size of Iran. Are we doing okay on time?
Yep, we have about an hour.
Oh, cool. Let's see. So that's the Iran update. I have a little bit more on Iran here, but this has more to do with Israel and Iran. I was talking before about how Israel has been stepping up cyber attacks and espionage against the Iranian nuclear program. This is something I kind of wanted to touch on a little more, because there's kind of been an escalating tit for tat between Iran and Israel over the past 10 years or so, but especially over the past year. And that's kind of worth touching on here. The first example I have here, as far as Israel directly attacking Iran's nuclear program, was Stuxnet. And I think this is pretty famous with a lot of people familiar with the tech sector and who work with computers. Stuxnet was a virus developed in Israel, which was very sophisticated. It was designed to basically overheat and destroy centrifuges in Iran's nuclear facilities. And unfortunately for the people who made it, the virus ended up getting out. It didn't necessarily do damage outside of Iran, but the problem is that hackers got the code, and so they were able to basically co-opt it for their own purposes. So now that's just kind of out in the world. But regardless, that was the first example of Israel trying to sabotage Iran's nuclear weapons program directly. There have also been a number of examples of Israel assassinating Iran's nuclear scientists. And this has happened off and on, again, for the past 10, 15 years or so. This isn't new at all. And of course, there was the high-profile assassination that I mentioned already of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. I apologize again for butchering his name. He was assassinated in November 2020, and he was high profile because he was actually Iran's leading nuclear technical expert. He also had a senior rank in the IRGC, so he was also kind of an officer in the military. I think I read that he was the guy that kind of kickstarted Iran's nuclear program, decades ago. So he was definitely one of their leading scientists. Not only in terms of the actual scientific work and research being done, but in terms of administration and leadership. So that was a pretty significant escalation there. And then more recently, there was an Israeli-owned cargo ship, the MV Helios, which was badly damaged while transiting the Gulf of Oman. I think that was January or February or so. Two large holes were ripped in the hull, and Israel blamed that on limpet mines used by the IRGC. So in retaliation for that, the Israelis attacked an Iranian vessel, which is suspected to be an intelligence vessel, called the Suez, which was anchored in the southern Red Sea. And the suspicion is that it's been involved in various special forces operations involving smuggling weapons to the Houthis in Yemen and other just forms of intelligence gathering. That was attacked with limpet mines as well, it seems. And probably Israel doing that. So that was the tit for the tat for the attacking of the Israeli cargo ship. And then over the past, 18 months, the Israelis have also targeted at least 12 ships bound for Syria carrying Iranian oil and military supplies. So that's also been kind of a running issue between them. And I don't have it in my notes here, but I also know that the Israelis have been doing semi-regular airstrikes in Syria targeting Iranian militias or Iranian allied militias, be they Syrian militias or Iraqi militias that have been flown in mostly by the Iranians to help Assad in the Syrian civil war. So that's also another point of confrontation between them. So all of this stuff has been escalating over the past, I want to say 4 months in particular. It used to happen kind of every couple weeks, maybe once a month. Now it's happening very, very regularly. So it's escalating rapidly. And exactly why is kind of tricky, because on the one hand, intuitively you would say the Israelis are worried the Iranians are going to get a bomb, and they're ramping up the pressure corresponding with how close they feel the Iranians are to getting one. But it could also be kind of wag the dog situation, because if you've been following Israeli politics, you know that Israeli politics are quite the horse and pony show lately. So it could be that Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking to distract the public and try to remind them that he's a strong leader. He's always kind of sold himself as strong on national security.
Well, and
So
he would
some
be
of it,
distracting them from the corruption allegations against him.
correct. So that could be the explanation there. I suspect it's a little bit of both, because I think Israelis in general are worried about Iran getting a bomb, regardless of political affiliation. And honestly, I think there is a very real danger that, regardless of what the United States does with Iran, if the Israelis feel that they're getting too close to a nuclear breakout threshold, they may themselves launch airstrikes against Iran. And at that point, it's anybody's guess how the Iranians will retaliate. I don't know that there's a whole lot they could realistically do beyond lobbing rockets at Israel, sort of like the Lebanon war back in 2006. But the Israelis would probably be able to retaliate pretty strongly to that too. There's kind of, as weird as it may sound, there is an asymmetry of power between Iran and Israel that actually favors Israel. You wouldn't think it, given that Israel has 7 million people, something like that, and Iran has upwards of 80 to 90 million people. So you would think that Iran would have some leverage there, but the Israeli military is sufficiently technologically advanced, and especially Israeli intelligence gathering is so advanced that the Iranians would be at a disadvantage if they tried to really do something. But that doesn't mean they wouldn't try to do something. And there's no guarantee that whatever retaliation they implemented would not result in a cascade of retaliations that resulted in a more serious conflict. So that's kind of what we're concerned about now and what we're watching. It's not, the U.S. tensions with Iran are sort of what makes the news headlines, but the real bigger threat is probably tension between Israel and Iran. Now, if the United States can bring the Iranians to a table and get some kind of agreement, maybe that de-escalates things between Iran and Israel to a degree, at least enough to remove the threat of a potential escalation to conflict. But even if the U.S. does reach a deal with Iran, there's still the possibility that Israel may end up launching airstrikes anyway. So things are a little bit delicate between the three countries right now, Israel, Iran, and the United States. And sort of that balance between the three is what we're kind of watching right now to see how that develops. So I would expect that we'll probably hear more about basically sort of, what would you call it, asymmetric conflict. Basically these little special forces raids and attacks on these ships, for example. We'll probably see more of that, more Israeli airstrikes in Syria, and maybe some more saber rattling from Israel as far as airstrikes on Iran. I think that's kind of what we have to look forward to for the next month or so. There's also some suspicion that Israel went out of its way to launch that cyber attack on the facility in Natanz recently in order to try to sabotage the talks between Iran and the United States. Israel has really wanted the United States to take a much harder line on Iran for a long time, and they've tried everything they can to try to push the United States into a more confrontational Iran policy. So it's not completely unreasonable. It's not completely out of bounds of possibility that Israel is maybe not as concerned with Iran getting a nuclear weapon as they are with the United States not being sufficiently hard on Iran getting a nuclear weapon. If Iran tries to really push for nuclear weapons, then Israel can do stuff about that. But if they don't have U.S. support or help, that kind of changes the calculus. So they would much rather be in a position where they have U.S. support, and so they're kind of trying, possibly, to sabotage the talks so that the U.S. can't really reach an agreement and are sort of boxed in to a hawkish Iran policy. Not saying that's necessarily the case. I'm just saying that's one possibility. That is one theory. And given how hawkish the Netanyahu government has been in Israel, that is quite possible. And again, it could just be wag the dog. It could just be a circus for the Israeli media so that Netanyahu can kind of weasel his way out of corruption allegations. Yeah, Netanyahu has definitely been doing a lot of weaseling the past couple years. I think we've talked about, actually, I have notes on that too, so we might as well just get into that. Israel had its fourth election in 2 years just recently.
They like elections.
It's actually, I really don't think they do at this point. I think they're all pretty sick of them. Yeah, the trouble is that every time they have an election, they end up with no particular coalition having enough seats to reach a majority and form a government. And it's always very close. You know, one or the other coalition is always just like a couple seats off, but nobody's able to close the difference. And the result is that they have to keep having elections. So they just had their fourth election, and the outcome looks like that they're going to have a fifth election. So that'll make 5 elections within, what, roughly 2.5 years or so. Pretty wild stuff for Israeli politics. There has been some change in the political calculus this time. Nobody had a clear majority again, but one of the weird outcomes is that one of the Arab Israeli political parties announced that they would be willing to form a coalition with Netanyahu's coalition, which would be bizarre because Netanyahu's coalition has been, I don't want to say far right. I don't think it's that bad, but it is significantly to the right. It's thoroughly right wing, shall we say. They're very pro-settler, they're very nationalist, and they're very skeptical of the Arab Israeli population. I think Israel's population is about 20% Arab, I want to say. Arab or Bedouin. I think they've also got some Bedouins in there. And Netanyahu's coalition and the Israeli right wing in general has never been very comfortable with them. They have a very hostile, confrontational attitude, relationship with the Arab population in Israel. So the idea of an Arab political party in Israel actually allying with Netanyahu's coalition is just very wild. That's just one of the weirder outcomes we've seen out of Israeli politics and out of this 2-year stretch of instability in particular. Let's see if I can find the actual name. It's the Ram Party. The Arab Israeli party in question is called the Ram Party. And it actually used to be a part of a broader Arab coalition of Arab parties that had been against Netanyahu. But the Ram Party and their leader, I think his name is Mansour Abbas, their leader basically decided that going against Netanyahu wasn't really doing them any favors, and it would be better to try to reach some kind of a agreement with Netanyahu so that they could get some benefits. You know, if Netanyahu wants them to be a part of the coalition, he's going to have to give concessions somewhere. And so the argument goes is basically like a realpolitik argument. You know, we may not like Netanyahu, but we're going to get more out of the Israeli government if we make a deal than if we just continue on the path of confrontation and trying to fight him. I think the Arab coalition that they left was called the Joint List. Yeah, the Joint List. And that had been a significant part of the Israeli political left. But they had not really been winning or, making any headway in terms of policy. So some Arabs in Israel have been getting very jaded and cynical, and their attitude is that the Ram Party has the right idea. We're not going to win anyway, so let's at least get some concessions out of it. Basically that kind of attitude. Let's see, I also had... one of the reasons that Netanyahu has been having so much trouble is that some individual parties and leaders have been turning on him on the far right. And that comes down to basically personality. Netanyahu has screwed some people over, offended some people, and he's done it to enough people now that it's actually just kind of a block of Israeli politics. Israeli politics at this point is not so much right versus left, so much as it is pro-Netanyahu versus people Netanyahu has pissed off. Mm-hmm. You might not think that's a coherent political bloc, and you would be right. It's a very unwieldy coalition, but it's large enough that Netanyahu has been unable to form a majority coalition. To give you an idea of some of the political forces at work here, the New Hope Party had been part of his coalition, and it's led by a guy named Gideon Sar. He broke with Netanyahu in December of 2020. So he's one of the more recent defectors. There's also an older rival named, I'm going to butcher his name, so I just apologize in advance. His name is Avigdor Lieberman, and he's the chair of the Yisrael Beitenu party. And this is a pro-settler far-right party that broke with Netanyahu a couple of years ago. And that break had to do with Mr. Lieberman here getting screwed out of a cabinet post in Netanyahu's government. So after that breakdown in relations between the two leaders, the parties broke. And now Lieberman has been one of the most prominent anti-Netanyahu politicians. There's also the New Right Party, Yamina, as led by a guy named Naftali Bennett. And this guy is Netanyahu's former chief of staff. And even he has now broken with Netanyahu and is trying to run against him. So that's a short list of some of the more high-profile defectors from Netanyahu's coalition, and it gives you an idea of the kind of personality clashes that have been happening. Let's see. On the political left, there's let's see what I have here. There is a future, the Yesh Atid party, and that's led by a guy named Yair Lapid, I want to say. And he actually formed this party in 2012, and he's avowedly centrist from what I was reading, and he mostly focused on economic issues. Housing, I think, started to be a big issue around 2012 or so, 10 years ago or so. And he's also opposed to the influence of ultra-Orthodox parties in Israeli politics. And the reason they're on my list here is that they did surprisingly well in last year's election. No, not last year's. The election after they formed, they did surprisingly well. I don't think they've done nearly as well since then. But here we go. Lapid was finance minister under Netanyahu after that. So they did surprisingly well after the party formed in 2012, and in the election after that, they were included in Netanyahu's coalition. Their leader became finance minister, and since then relations broke down, and now Lapid is part of the Blue and White coalition, which is the principal anti-Netanyahu coalition at this point. He actually broke with the Blue and White coalition in 2020 because of the unity government that they agreed to with Netanyahu. One of the big things that happened in 2020 was COVID. I'm sure everybody remembers. But the effect COVID had on Israeli politics is that, in general, there was a broad demand by the Israeli body politic for a unity government between Netanyahu and the opposition parties. They wanted there to be a unity government in order to steer Israel through the crisis. And there was a lot of people in the opposition who were for that, but there were just as many that absolutely hated the idea, because they just wanted to focus on getting Netanyahu out, and they kind of smelled blood in the water and thought they kind of had him. But because of COVID, they ended up having to get into the unity government, and so a lot of people were upset, and Lapid here was one of them. So he actually broke with the Blue and White coalition. I don't know that he wouldn't return if conditions were right for it, but he's another example of somebody who Netanyahu basically aggravated and alienated and is now a political opponent. We already talked about the Joint List and the Ram Party. And let's see, I think we could, no, okay. So the results of the most recent election were that Likud, which is Netanyahu's party and coalition, they won about 52 seats. The opposition parties won 57 seats. 61 seats are needed for a majority. And thus far, nobody has been willing to kind of bridge the gap. None of the minor opposition parties or whatnot have been willing to defect from their respective coalitions. And as a result, it's just another stalemate. But that's just a quick snapshot of Israeli politics here, and it just illustrates the degree to which Israeli politics has become the Netanyahu show. And it's looking like it's going to continue to be the Netanyahu show, because from what I was reading, they're in store for a fifth election later this year. So that'll be something else to watch. Yet more drama in Israeli politics. So that's a quick review of Iran, Israel, and Israel-Iranian tension. I guess not so quick. That probably lasted a while.
That's good. Like we said before, if you have an overarching theme for a big chunk of an Agent Smith discussion, then that's a nice title that people can return to. Like last week, we did South America and Central Asia.
Yeah. We could do more Central Asia. Because last time we just talked about updates, but we didn't really talk much about the region in general.
Mm-hmm.
We could do that sometime too. I've still got more stuff on the Middle East though, so we might dig into that a little bit more. And if we have time left, maybe we could do more Central Asia. If you want, we could skip it and go to Central Asia now. I'm flexible, but I'm just throwing out the possibilities here.
I'm just really close to sneezing. Okay, I think I'm good.
So what's your pleasure?
We don't need to skip it. We did some Central Asia last time. What was the other thing you said? You had for us?
More Middle East. More Middle East, as opposed to a more general discussion of Central Asia and the politics, economies, and demographies thereof.
More Middle East.
More Middle East, okay. I don't think I have too much more, but let me check. The principal other topic I had for the Middle East was Saudi Arabia. Because one of the things that the Biden administration did when it came into office was to start pressuring the Saudis more on the litany of things that are causing problems in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. So there's been some changes there, although not a whole lot, but it's worth kind of getting into. Let me see if I can find that. We did Israel, Iran, and Palestine won't take long. Oh, and I already kind of mentioned that. All right, so let's get into that. Actually, here's something, Neuro. Do you remember the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal?
Oh man, the memes from that one. We had memes for days. All kinds of different "I'm stuck, please help me out" kind of things. Pretty good.
I have something to show you from that. I put it in the Discord here. So this is a picture, and I hope it's still up on Reddit, but it's a picture that shows the backup of ships outside the southern end of the Suez Canal. And it just gives you an idea of just how congested international traffic became because of that incident.
Oh wow. That's boats for days. Yeah, and one thing that I learned was pretty expensive is just keeping a ship operating. You have to burn through fuel to keep it online, that's very costly. Putting it in port is also expensive. I think I was reading some about abandoned cruise ships because that's something that has been a major byproduct of COVID and the pandemic is people aren't going on cruises, and it costs a shit ton of money to keep a cruise ship at port. Mm-hmm. It also costs a lot just to keep it running in general, but they're not getting any money in. And either they abandon a ship or they keep it at sea with a skeleton crew, which I think is probably cheaper, but obviously worse for the environment. Or they just, what were the options? They port it, they keep it at sea, or they abandon it and just say, we're done with this.
Interesting.
But we'll see if that's one of the markets that rebounds or not. Are people going to want to go on cruises again? Like they're going to want to buy clothes and cars again? We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Please show pic. It says the post was removed, but I can still see the video. Or I'll post it here for you.
I put it in the other channel on Discord, the one where we get the questions.
Yeah, I just put it in the Twitch chat so people can see.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, it was more than a few ships. Okay, let's see. Where's... Do that, get that. No, not that. Oh, we should... we probably won't have time for that. Wait, what was I going to do? Saudi Arabia. There we go. Okay, so just this is a quick run through of some of the things that have been happening in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And I know we've kind of touched on the U.S. a lot today, but the U.S. is kind of important globally, just in a lot of different regions and regional issues. So we kind of can't help but talk about it. And the Biden administration is making changes and whatnot, so it's kind of have to get into it. It's kind of hard to avoid. So let's see. In terms of defense, the Biden administration has pledged to protect Saudi security interests and to help Saudi Arabia defend itself against attack. And specifically, they cited the example of Houthi armed drones being launched from Yemen. So this is significant because it reaffirms the defense cooperation, for lack of a better phrase, between the United States and the Saudis. The United States does not have any kind of treaty alliance with the Saudis. It's kind of an informal arrangement by which they kind of align with each other. But the relationship had kind of been strained under the Trump administration. You know, the Saudis in particular were worried after the United States did not really respond forcefully when the Iranians slash Houthis attacked that oil refinery on the east coast of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were getting kind of concerned that maybe the United States was not actually going to defend them if it came under attack. So for the Biden administration to come out and reaffirm U.S. commitment to defending the Saudis really doubles down on that relationship, kind of clarifies things and repairs some of that damage. Ideally, that'll help the Saudis become a little less crazy in their foreign policy. They've been pretty adventurous for a while now, for different reasons, but one of the reasons is concern about the U.S. commitment to Saudi security. So the U.S. can kind of assuage the Saudis a little bit by committing to their defense, and in doing so, ideally, it'll result in a little less adventurism in Saudi foreign policy. It's not going to be enough in and of itself to stop adventurism, especially since a lot of it stems from MBS, you know, Mohammed bin Salman and some of his policy preferences. But it'll help. You know, it's a step in the right direction. So let's see. On Yemen, the Biden administration suggested the U.S. take the spearhead in a diplomatic solution. And they also named a respected and experienced special envoy specifically for this issue. And obviously, the Biden administration pulled support for the war. You know, technically, the United States had already done that. Congress had kind of forced the Trump administration's hand in that regard. So a lot of the support the United States had been sending to the Saudis and the Saudi military in Yemen, a lot of that actually got pulled in, like, I want to say 2019. Because I do remember Congress voting on that and it kind of being a big point of debate for a while. So it's not necessarily a big change here, but it does at least show that the Biden administration is interested in taking on more of a diplomatic role, whereas before it was more just military supplies. Do we give them supplies or not? Now it's looking like there's actually going to be some diplomatic involvement, which increases the probability of a negotiated settlement. It's still pretty unlikely, but again, at least they're trying. It's better than nothing. For Qatar, the Saudis ended a blockade of Qatar. We talked about this way back when it first started, I think like 2017 or so. The Saudis, as well as some of their other allies in the GCC, instituted a blockade of Qatar. It was not like a full blockade. It's not like they had ships blockading Qatari ports, but they did close off the border Qatar had with Saudi Arabia, such that people couldn't move back and forth. And there was also basically a collapse in trade relations. You know, they just cut off all trade with Qatar. So in effect, that's what the blockade was, kind of soft blockade. And the Saudis and the GCC had done that because the Qataris have kind of long been a rival to these other countries in terms of how they want to manage the region's affairs and just in general regional influence. You know, the Qataris in general are a little more about Islamism, not like radical Islamism per se, but just more about opening up political systems so that Islam can play more of a role. It's kind of almost more about democratization. I know some people will quibble with that. Some people will say like the Muslim Brotherhood is a radical organization and the Qataris are trying to get them in power in different countries. That's a whole other debate. But in general, the thing to know here is just that the Qataris just have a very different vision for the future and how they want to use their influence to achieve that future than other countries in the GCC. So the Biden administration really leaned on the Saudis to end that blockade. because obviously the Qataris and the Saudis are both allies of the United States, and it doesn't really help U.S. interests in the region to have allies fighting with each other like this. So the Saudis have announced that they've ended that blockade, and I assume the GCC will fall into line and do the same. So that should help ease tensions a bit between those parties, even if it's only artificially at the behest of the United States. Let's see. So the Biden administration has also been pressuring them on human rights concerns, obviously. And one of the things the Saudis did in response was to release some political prisoners. Let's see. They released. I don't know. I don't have the exact number, but it was some like maybe a couple dozen or so. The high-profile one was Lujain al-Hathlao. It's a terrible day for names for me. I'll apologize again for butchering these names, but I want to say her name is Lujain al-Hathlao, and she was a feminist, I believe, who had advocated for equal rights in Saudi Arabia, whom was arrested. She was released to her family, albeit on probation. So it's probationary release, but not in prison anymore. So that's a direct result of the Biden administration putting that pressure on them to try to do something like that. On education, so this other stuff here, I have two more items on this list, and both of them don't have to do with the Biden administration. Neither of them have to do with the Biden administration. They both have to do with modernization programs that have been implemented by MBS. One of the things MBS has wanted to do, besides have a more hawkish foreign policy, where Saudi Arabia is more involved in the region's affairs, the other big policy goal for him has been to try to modernize the Saudi economy. And that process has been very hit or miss. It has not been entirely successful. There's been some areas of improvement, but in general, they've kind of been struggling with that. But part of that drive has been investing in human capital and improving the judicial system. So that's what these two reforms here have been about. So as far as education, one of the things that they've done is that they've revised state-approved school books, which had promoted martyrdom and anti-Semitism. So that's kind of more of a soft political change, but it does illustrate that MBS and sort of the new Saudi Arabia that he's trying to build is not going to be quite as beholden to the political demands and preferences of the most conservative radical clerics in Saudi Arabia. The country basically is forcibly liberalizing, which I think is something a lot of people outside Saudi Arabia have kind of long lobbied for. MBS is kind of doing it in a forceful way, but it is happening, and this is one of the manifestations of that. Judicial reform. Let's see. This is something I don't have the specifics on that, but in general, I read that there were some reforms implemented that moved the Saudi legal system towards a fully codified legal system. Before it had been based more on Sharia law, Islamic law, etc. There had not really been clear codes or laws about a lot of things. Let me read my notes real quick. Here we go. I'll just read it verbatim for you. So a Saudi official released a statement saying that they were setting clear codes to 4 major and fundamental laws through applying the best international practices and standards. So 4 specific areas there that they're focused on changing. Now, this is not a full codification of Saudi law here, but it is a move in that direction. And, given the general trend towards modernization, this is probably going to be the first step of several steps that are going to result in a more modern legal system in Saudi Arabia. Besides the old law being sort of out of date, another problem with it is that it left a lot of discretionary power in the hands of judges. According to Sharia law, the judge basically has broad power to pass judgment on the people in the court and in a given court case. And, the benefit to that is that you get a faster decision. It's pretty decisive. But the downside is that things can be very inconsistent. There's not really a notion of, what would you call it, precedent in Sharia law that you see in something like common law in Anglo-Saxon countries. So it's not like one Sharia judge is going to try to figure out what the precedent is for how a given law is enforced. Generally, they all enforce the given laws on a case-by-case basis.
So what precedent means is you look to other similar rulings in the past and you try to strive for consistency.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's major component of the common law legal system in places like England, the United States, etc. It is not used in Sharia law. And, again, I'm sure there's some benefits to that, but the cost is that it makes it really hard to kind of be able to predict what given actions are going to be judged illegal and which are not. So having a more predictable legal system is desirable, not only just in general, but also especially for the business community, because they want to know that their contracts are going to be enforced fairly and consistently. So a shift towards codification is a shift towards a more predictable legal system, and that's, in general, just a shift towards a more modern legal system. So that's your Saudi Arabia update. A little bit of modernization and a little bit of kowtowing to US pressure. Let's see, I did have a quick item on Palestine, which is that the United States government announced that it was going to restore funding, or maybe not funding, but aid. They were going to restore financial aid to the Palestinian Authority. And if you don't know what the Palestinian Authority is, that's basically just the government of Palestine. Although more specifically, it's the government of Palestine in the West Bank. Technically, Hamas still governs, technically Hamas governs the Gaza Strip. It used to be the Palestinian Authority governed both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, both of the major territories of, both of the major Palestinian territories and the Levant there. But there was a whole kerfuffle, shall we say. There was an election, I think around 2006 or so, 2006 or 2007 in Palestine. It was one of the first open elections that the Palestinian Authority had held. And the result of the election is that the PLO, which had been the dominant political force in Palestinian politics for decades, thoroughly got its ass kicked in the election. And that just had to do with corruption and a lack of progress in the peace talks and just a general sense that they were an ineffective political force. So people voted instead for an opposition party called Hamas, which was very controversial because Hamas was not originally a political party. It was originally a terrorist group, and still is, technically. So, unsurprisingly, the United States, and especially Israel, did not react very well to a terrorist group being elected as the head of the Palestinian Authority. So the result was that the Israelis immediately, or almost immediately, declared a blockade, basically, of Palestine. And the PLO, for its part, refused to hand over authority over the West Bank to Hamas. So, in effect, the result of the election was annulled, basically, and the PLO stayed in power even though they'd lost the election. The problem that they had is that Hamas, the base of power for Hamas was in the Gaza Strip. That's where most of their supporters were. So after the election, Hamas was able to very quickly seize control of the Gaza Strip when it became apparent that the PLO was not going to recognize the result of the election. So because the PLO was technically sort of working with the Israelis at that point, there was a kind of de facto partition of Palestine at that point between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, both of which are controlled now by the PLO and Hamas, respectively. Yeah, the financial aid to the Palestinian Authority had been removed by the Trump administration as a way to try to pressure them into reaching a peace deal with the Israelis. That obviously didn't work. But now that the Biden administration is back in, they're not as interested in kind of pushing the Palestinians. They see more value in trying to make sure they're well enough funded that people don't feel the need to turn to extremism. The Israelis themselves were actually pretty skeptical about stripping the Palestinians of financial aid like that. Their worry is that conditions would get worse and people would be radicalized, which would be more of a problem for them than the status quo. And I think they actually did pick up some of the slack from that, I think. Maybe I'm misremembering. But that's one of the changes as far as Palestinian policy for the U.S. administration. Haven't heard much else. I don't know if they're really going to jump into the whole peace deal thing. Pretty much every president for the past 40-some years has tried to negotiate peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and pretty much to no avail. Yeah, the what I read in what back in the day on Foreign Policy Mag was that the problem with the Arab-Israeli peace talks, specifically the Palestinian-Israeli peace talks, is that you can't force the negotiating parties to negotiate peace if they themselves don't want to negotiate peace. And that's kind of always been the problem with the Israelis and the Palestinians. There's always one faction or the other that's just does not want to give ground and prefers the status quo to giving the kinds of concessions that would be necessary to actually reach a long-lasting peace deal. Arab-Israeli peace is easy by comparison. With Arab-Israeli peace, that's really taken off in the past year because of Iran more than anything. It's kind of the common foe, pretty much. Okay. So that was Palestine. Did we get a chance to talk about Jordan at all?
Not last time.
Okay, I think I mentioned it, but I don't think we got into it too much. So yeah, there was the royal family that controls Jordan. I think they're called the Hashemites, something like that. Basically, what happened is that the king that had ruled Jordan for a long time died around late 90s or so, maybe early aughts. And he had, excuse me, he had a particular son that he'd been grooming in order to become king. So when he died, that Prince Hamza, had expected to be appointed the new king. But that's not what happened. Instead, it actually went to another son, basically somebody who I think had better connections or was better trusted or something. I don't quite remember what the genesis of that was. But basically, this guy kind of got screwed out of the throne. And he's been pretty butthurt about it for a long time. But he hasn't really done anything about it until a couple weeks ago. And it's not entirely clear just what he was trying to do. The allegation is that he was trying to conspire with a foreign power to seize control of the throne. But the only thing we've really seen publicly is some very angry social media. He kind of came out accusing the king of corruption, of incompetence, this, that, and the other, and just kind of made a show of trying to undermine the king's authority. So the government went out of its way to arrest him, unsurprisingly, and whatever coup it was he was plotting fell apart and didn't end up going anywhere. But the Jordanian government has been kind of shaken by that. And there's some concern that maybe the king's control of the country is not as solid as he might like. Now, you might not care too much about Jordan because you can probably count on one hand the number of times people have heard about Jordan in the media. It's a pretty quiet country. It's relatively pro-Western. The king and his dynasty was actually installed by the West. It was one of the countries that was carved out of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And what the British did in all of the territories that they took out of the Ottoman Empire is that they placed kings in control of them. So there was a pro-Western king put in control of Iraq, and then another one in control of what was called Jordan, or the Transjordan, I think. And that worked for them for a while. And they were all, and the family members in the royal family, they get educated in the West. I think the male members almost all go to Sandhurst Military Academy in London, even today. A little bit of residual British influence there. Well, Sandhurst is basically the UK's equivalent to West Point. For those of you maybe not familiar with Sandhurst, it's basically like the UK's leading military academy for officers. And a lot of Arab royalty in the Middle East actually send their sons to Sandhurst. The Jordanians are not unusual in that. That's actually pretty common. That's a way of cementing ties between the West and the various monarchies in the Gulf. But anyway, the West kind of put them in power, and the Jordanian government has been pretty pro-Western ever since, unsurprisingly. The interesting thing about Jordan is not so much that the Jordanians and the Jordanian government are still friendly with the West, even after almost a century of Western activity in the Middle East that is more than a little distasteful to a lot of people there. The real surprise is that the West is still so friendly to Jordan, because Jordan really does not have a whole lot to offer the West. It is not an oil-producing country. Keep that in mind. A lot of people associate Gulf monarchies and the kings and whatnot with, super wealthy petrostates and just lavish spending, this kind of thing. Jordan is not one of those countries. They do have a monarchy, they do have a king, but they are not a rich country by any stretch. They don't have billions and billions of dollars in oil revenue like the Saudis do, or the Kuwaitis, or whomever. So it's a relatively poor country, and a lot of the economy is agricultural. In fact, I think a lot of it is, what do they call them? Dates?
Yeah, dates of fruit.
Yeah, dates and olives. I think they grow those over there in the sort of the Transjordan region.
Hmm.
So a lot of the good relationship between Jordan and the West comes down to just geography. They used to have a hostile relationship with Israel, so the United States and the West tried to negotiate peace, and Jordan was one of the first countries to agree to something resembling peace with Israel. I don't think they had full peace until relatively recently, like the past year or so with the Trump administration's Arab-Israeli peace push. But beyond that, let's see, they were one of the first to de facto make peace with Israel. And oh, right, I was talking about the importance of geography. So the importance of geography, it's next to Israel, so there's a desire by the West to try to push peace there. But then they're also right next to just everybody else. They have borders with Israel, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, which are all pretty significant countries and very in their own way. So being centrally located means that Jordan's location is very strategic, and that makes it very useful for the West. They can kind of use Jordan as a jumping off point for special forces operations, intelligence gathering operations, etc. And the Jordanian intelligence agency also has close ties to the West. And because they're Arabs, they're a lot more attuned to Arab culture, and are just a lot more sensitive to the nuances and niceties of Arab intelligence gathering in the region. They just kind of have that home field advantage. So they're a very effective ally in trying to fight terrorism and other sundry, insurgent groups, Iranian-aligned militias, you name it. So the relationship is largely predicated not on oil, like it is with other Gulf monarchies. In Jordan's case, it's largely predicated on strategic location and intelligence sharing. And that relationship has worked for a surprisingly long time, just on pretty much those two accounts.
I just pulled it up on the map here. You've got Israel directly to the west. It sort of looks like it touches Lebanon to the north and west. Syria is directly north. Iraq is north and east. And then Saudi Arabia is to the south and west. So it's landlocked aside from...
Not quite.
There's a Gulf
right
of...
Southwest, yeah.
Aqaba? The Gulf of Aqaba looks like it reaches in.
Yeah, just barely. You can see Israel actually also has like a very tiny slice of coastline there. They make good use of that, and they're pretty smart about that.
Yeah, I would guess that's a very crucial port for them.
Yeah, very strategic. Let's see. And I guess I don't know as much about Jordanian geography, but I guess they probably do have a port or something down there.
Mm-hmm. Looks like they have at least a couple cities there, which I would imagine people can put their boats and do stuff.
Yeah, so having the king of Jordan, the fact that he is having potentially trouble maintaining power could be a problem for the West. Because he is he's not necessarily the most powerful ally the West has there, but he's probably the most reliable. He doesn't make waves in the same way that the Saudis do, and the country is more stable than Iraq, for example. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty reliable ally, and I'm sure the West would prefer that he kind of keep a handle on things. It's made even more complicated by the fact that Jordan's population is like 40% Palestinian. So a huge chunk of the population is not actually originally from Jordan. A big chunk of them were actually either born in Palestine, or they're descendants of people who were born in Palestine. You may wonder why people who were born in Jordan but to Palestinian parents might not be considered Jordanian. That just has to do with the whole politics of Palestinian refugees, which is a whole clusterfuck, in and of itself. Basically, a lot of Arab states in the region make a big show about supporting Palestinians and showing solidarity with Palestinians, but very few of them really like hosting Palestinian refugees because there's so many of them that they impact local labor markets. And that creates more competition in economies that are already kind of underperforming. A lot of them are very blue collar, sort of low wage economies. And so introducing a lot more blue collar labor in the form of refugees just kind of makes things harder. So a lot of countries in the Middle East, Arab countries, actually don't like hosting refugees. And the ones that do host refugees generally will impose restrictions on the refugees' right to work. So you may be allowed to come in as a Palestinian refugee into a place like Lebanon or Jordan or wherever, but you may find it relatively difficult to work, if not impossible, depending on the rules in place. So as you can imagine, it's a little bit risky having policies in place like that when 40% of your population is being subjected to those kinds of restrictions.
Mm.
So that's a major source of potential instability in Jordan. And one of the reasons that occasionally there are outbreaks of protests and whatnot against the government. A lot of the Palestinian refugees don't like the way the government handles them. And the way they're growing, they could be a majority of the country before too long. So it's not necessarily a sustainable set of policies that they're implementing there right now. Let's see, how are we doing now? Is that...
It could be a reasonable wrapping up point.
Okay. Let's see. I don't know if I have... Yeah, I don't think I have anything else I can kind of throw in here short term. So probably just call it. I did have other cool stuff to talk about. We'll try to get to that some other time. I had the Biden administration, well, before it was the administration, the Biden campaign did release some hints about what potential agreement they might make with China as far as what the terms of their relationship would be going forward. Obviously there's a lot of tension in the trading relationship there, but there's some question about just how to fix that. Do you just say screw it and completely throw open trade and just kind of accept the fact that there's going to be unfair competition? Do you shut down trade completely and just try to make do as best you can without China trade? Or do you do something in between? It's almost certainly going to be something in between, but where along the spectrum you are is kind of in question. So I kind of took some statements from their campaign and kind of organized it to try to give you a sneak preview of what that negotiated agreement may end up looking like in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds boring, but it's actually pretty cool because it's probably the most tangible proposal I've seen for managing the issue with unfair trade with China that I've seen yet. So even if it doesn't get implemented, it's worth talking about because it's actually a pretty neat look at policy.
Yep, we're going through a realignment. It wasn't really a small change, even though Biden is the, quote, compromise candidate. The stances on a lot of different countries seems to be pretty different, but there's a major difference between what people say and then what they actually deliver during their presidency. Yeah. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, the trade issue is kind of on the back burner right now because of all the other drama going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they'll get to it eventually, I suspect. They've been pretty brisk in terms of moving from policy issue to policy issue and getting stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
So they've actually been pretty good about that. So I don't doubt that they'll get to it eventually, but it's just not clear when. Oh, and by the way, to the guy in chat who last time wanted to talk about gun regulation, Biden administration's proposed gun regulation. There's not a whole lot of meat to that. I suspect that's mostly just for theater, basically. Did you see that at all, Neuro?
I did not.
Basically, he wants to regulate ghost guns. Have you ever heard of those?
No. What are ghost guns?
Ghost guns are sort of this kitschy name for guns that you make with 3D printers.
Mm.
And the trouble with those guns is that you can't trace them back to the manufacturer or to the buyer or anything. So that hence the name ghost guns. You don't know where they came from. They just kind of appear and disappear. So there's a desire by the administration to try to do something about that. So there's not just a flood of unmarked, untraceable weapons, floating around. But I don't know how much traction there is for that in the legislature. The Democratic Party obviously would be interested in doing something like that, but I don't know how much support they have. And more to the point, I don't know how effective it would be even if they did do something, because that's just really difficult to police inherently. People have 3D printers now, and the designs for guns are out there. They tried to stop them from distributing the designs for guns on 3D printers, but there's such a thing as BitTorrent still. So you can probably still find it if you really want to. I'm not saying you should, but it's just really hard to shut down information on the internet. The internet is kind of custom designed to spread information, no matter how much you might not want it to spread.
Man, that got me to immediately think of the "you wouldn't download a car" or "you wouldn't steal a car" campaign they were doing against internet piracy, and it's like, you wouldn't download a car. A lot of people would. Would you download designs for a gun? Ghost guns, are they more effective against ghosts? I don't know.
I'm afraid not.
Well, in the U.S., it's really not hard to acquire weapons. That just seems like another way that people are concerned that there are more guns, but we have so many guns per capita, it's silly. A big issue, I think, is getting to the ideology level, because a lot of people who are going out and doing evil stuff with guns, they're being radicalized. So a multi-method approach is usually best. So being able to make sure you're not handing out guns to people who are radicalized or who are unstable. And in addition, just educating people about how to interact with society in a way that you can get your points across without violence. We started off this conversation that way and talking about some of these radical groups who are involved in the Capitol riots and that kind of thing, and how there's a peaceful way to go about pursuing change and there's a violent way. Just educating people on how do I engage with my local state government, how do I express my opinions in ways that are not going to be damaging to society.
Bingo. Now, do we have 5 minutes here for flag review?
Sure.
Well, I was going to say hello to Mr. Curacao again. I always notice the flag. It always stands out. I always look at it and wonder, what is that? And then it's, Curacao. Let's see. And then I noticed we had somebody from the Bahamas. I don't think I've seen the Bahamas flag in here before. So whoever you are, Mr. Bahamas, hello. Maybe post in chat something. What's going on in the Bahamas lately? I don't think I've heard anything in the news about them. First-person accounts are always welcome and encouraged.
And these episodes do go up on YouTube as well, so if you want to make a comment after the fact, you may do so. Or if you're listening or watching from YouTube, hello. Thank you for your viewership and your interest. If there are any spicy, dicey, fun comments, I can pass them along to Agent Smith, because they're valued, especially if we said something wrong. We're not here to try to make people think a certain way. We're just trying to figure out what's going on and talk about it in a even-handed manner if we can.
Yeah. Let's see. We had somebody from Liechtenstein. Really?
Ulrich von Liechtenstein? Have you seen Knight's Tale? It's a good movie.
No, I don't know who you are. This person listening from Liechtenstein. I've never seen the Liechtenstein flag in here. Yeah, maybe post a little bit about yourself. I'm curious. You don't have to if you don't want to, but hello. I think it's pretty cool. Liechtenstein doesn't get a lot of attention, unfortunately. Let's see. And I think there was one more that caught my eye. Where was it? Oh, maybe they left. No, that's not Thailand. That's what it was. Yeah, shout out to the guy from Thailand listening, or gal from Thailand listening. Good luck with the protest movement. I haven't heard any updates on that, but I'm sure it's ongoing.
The friend of mine who got me into StarCraft 2 is from Thailand. He speaks Thai, he has family who lives there, and he was talking about their quarantine procedure and how they have these entire compounds where they have hotels in places, and before you're able to get into the rest of Thailand, you have to stay at one of these hotels for 2 weeks or whatever the quarantine period is.
I think that's all I had for flags. Thank you for indulging me.
No problem.
I always have fun with these.
We have our U.S. bias because that's where we live, so it's good to get some perspectives from other places. And anytime you're talking about a country that's very far from where you are, you're just going off of news. Like, we haven't been to Jordan, so if we're talking about Jordan, I've never been there. I'm guessing you've never been there. If you're Jordanian and you see what's going on and we don't have it correct, it would be nice to learn. So feel free to share.
Please do. But thanks again for having me. Always fun. Much appreciated.
Thank you, sir, for your knowledge and wisdom and input in these variety of issues. Except cryptocurrency. We still don't know about that one.
Someday.
Thank you, chat, for your questions and your interest. And thank you, Neuro, for passing along some questions. We didn't really tackle too many. There was the personal finance one and stuff, but we had a good bit of talk about the Middle East. So if you missed part of this, it'll be on YouTube pretty soon. Take care of yourselves and try to factor in the bias in the media that you're consuming and check yourself. I know confirmation bias is very seductive and it feels really nice to know that you're very smart and correct, but we're wrong about a lot of stuff and we need to be updating our perspectives. So thank you, Mr. Agent Smith, and we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion.
Yeah. See you next time.
GG.